Welcome to Charts Today. My name is David Linton, and today's edition for Tuesday, the 30th of July, comes to you from London. And the dollar is rising. We're seeing quite a lot of turmoil, obviously, in sterling and the euro, which we'll talk about in a minute. But the dollar is rising, looking more and more bullish on that medium-term chart, testing some resistance now, and we are just bullish now on all three time frames. We do still have this upside target here of 15% and a downside target of 26%. These are long-term targets. But interestingly, we're seeing the dollar appreciate. So this dollar strength coming back to rule. Looking at the euro against the dollar, we see, of course, that the euro is weaker and much more clearly weaker on the medium and long-term charts. Short term, we're just hovering around neutral. Against the yen, the dollar is a little bit weaker, the yen being the safe haven, but again, we are still bullish on the short-term chart, so that dollar bullishness study is showing through. Of course, the big news this last couple of days has been sterling, and sterling really diving away yesterday. We saw a big move there yesterday. We've been lower this morning, and we have found some support at about the 121.20 level. So it's interesting to see that bounce. Now, these support levels become really critical if we go lower than that. So there's buyers who've been prepared to buy at that level. If we go lower than that level, we break the support level. Those buyers are wrong, and they'll potentially liquidate, and these guys here have effectively won. So this level 121.20 is just a level that's been set this morning, and it's become a very short-term level to watch. We do have downside targets to 119.40 and 120. So dead. So we are just seeing that 120 level is where targets are eyeing up for, but long term, all the targets are much more bearish, parity and below. So 105 is a target, and that's an historic low. I think 108 is the historic low for sterling against the dollar. So we are just seeing big downside targets, but of course the main thing at the moment is just to watch the shorter term charts. If you're trading currencies, keep an eye on the 1 minute chart. Taking a look at sterling against the euro, we dived here yesterday as well, and again we've found a support level here this morning, and this is the point about activation. We've got a downside target to 102, which is 6% lower. If we fall below this low that we've seen this morning, we effectively activate that target, so that would be bad. We've also got a big downside target here on the long-term chart of 88 pence to the euro, and that would be activated if we made new lows as well. Sterling against the Swiss franc sitting at 120, so quite key there, and against the Aussie dollar also making new lows, but just bouncing back this morning. Bitcoin now pretty much stuck below this $10,000 level, sitting at $9,487 this morning, short-term bearish, and the price is coming back to wander below the cloud, starting to look like this was a double top, and we might just see the height of that top being the downside level here. We have got downside targets of 4% and 14% respectively on the short-term chart, activated another one of 11% on the medium-term chart. The US market was down slightly last night, just really holding on to its position bullish on all three time frames. The Nasdaq was down just under 0.5%, also holding on to its bullish position. The Dow also just holding on, and the Russell 2000 is bullish above the cloud on the short-term chart, but still a long way from making a new high. The futures this morning, S&P future is down about 0.25%, and the Nasdaq E-mini down 0.4%, so it does suggest that the US market will open lower. The FTSE 100 is actually up slightly this morning, and that is the sterling effect. 80% of earnings in the FTSE 100 companies are in non-sterling, so the pound falling has an inverse effect where the earnings of these companies will go up, and so consequently we're seeing a slight improvement on the index. And yesterday we jumped very much on that sterling fall. Doesn't affect midcaps as much, and they're slightly down this morning, but the trend that we've seen over the last week or two is still in train, so midcaps still looking pretty good on the short and medium term chart. The DAX is down significantly this morning, down 1.3%, diving into bearish territory on the short-term chart. We've got a downside target of 2.5%. On the short-term chart, we've actually got two targets there, so that gives us more providence that we probably will go to that level. The CAC 40 in Paris also diving down 0.8% and starting to look more bearish on that short-term chart. Japan actually was up slightly overnight, and the Hang Seng also up slightly, although it's still bearish on all three time frames. And in Shanghai, we're up again there as well, but are still bearish on all three time frames. The Sensex was down 0.7%, so it is starting to look a little bit more worrying on that medium-term chart, just breaking below. So the Indian market, really the star performer of late, is just starting to unwind a bit of that performance. We still have these long-term targets here, but we now have short-term downside potential of about 4% on the Indian market. Looking at the S&P Australian index, that's looking pretty good, holding on to its gains and making record highs. So the Aussie market is looking pretty good. Brent crude sitting in bullish territory on the short-term chart, but not on the medium and long-term charts. $64 looking pretty strong. There's a shortage of upside targets here on that chart. 66 is one target that we've got. We might be hitting some resistance here, according to the point and figure short-term chart. And WTI Texas Light is actually looking pretty bullish as well on that short-term chart, with some upside of about 2.4%. US nat gas has been sinking lower, and this $2 mark is now looking pretty critical for nat gas. It looks like that's where we're wanting to go. We've got a downside target of 192, and we've got another downside target of 183. So nat gas in the US just looking pretty vulnerable to further falls. Gold is up slightly this morning, sitting at 14.28 in bullish territory on all three time frames and good upside targets. So gold still holding on. Silver also holding on to its bullish position and making a long-term transition. It's a bit behind gold in doing this, but it is making a long-term transition. Looking at the 10-year yields, we see that yields are sitting at 2.05%. We're just teetering along this level, really waiting for the next reaction from the Fed to move the dial there. And looking at the Bund German bonds are continuing to rise in this uncertainty. We had a bit of a wobble last week with the ECB announcements, but we are still just bullish on bond prices, but that's bad for yields, of course. Looking now at the stocks, we'll look at the Dow. So the best performer in the Dow last night was Intel. They were up 1.8%, looking pretty bullish and moving into bullish territory on this medium-term chart. They've underperformed the market. They had a terrible May, but now bouncing back. So interesting to see here that we might be making a transition to bullish. Pfizer Group, they were down 3.8%, so not looking good there, so that they were hit quite heavily. On the Nasdaq, the best performer was Mylan. They were up 12.5%. Tesla, interestingly, up 3.4%, but not enough really to take this chart bullish. And if we look at the bearish stocks, we had PayPal. They were down 3.5%. So interesting to see there. In the Aussie market, the best performers overnight, we had Credit Corp. They were up 4%. Newcrest Mining were up 3%. And that chart looking absolutely stellar, Newcrest there, and got some really good upside targets. They've outperformed the market by 35% this year. Bingo Industries were the worst performer, and WiseTech, they were down 3.8%. These prices are all coming to, of course, from Yahoo Finance. If we look at the Indian market, again, we see a lot of stocks sold off. We had Bharti Airtel, they were up 3.4%, and on the downside, we had Yes Bank yet again in the laggards, and really just continuing their dive lower, underperforming the market so far this year by some 40%. There we see the live pricing coming in this morning. Taking a look now at the European market, we look at the FTSE 100 stocks. BP is the best performer this morning. They're up 2.8%. Coca-Cola up 1.6%. Diageo up 1.3%. This chart's still looking pretty good, although the relative just diving a little bit there. If we look at the downside, the big story this morning is Centrica down 12.5%. Their chief executive set to depart. worse than expected results, and they've underperformed the market by 50% this year, we see, versus the Dow Jones. So looking pretty worrying. Other airline stocks lower. EasyJet down 3.3%. IAG, which British Airways, Iberia, they're down nearly 3% as well. So we are seeing that being quite hit. We're seeing financials down as well. Royal Bank of Scotland down 1.7%. So we are just seeing a hit there, and there was a live pricing coming in again from Yahoo Finance. Looking at the 250, we've got Sana Group, they're up 7%. BBA Aviation, they're up 6%. So we are seeing some pretty strong performers there this morning in the 250 index. On the downside, we've got CYBG. They're down 21%, so that's a really big fall there. And Greencore, they're down 5%, so that's quite big. Sorry, that was 10% they're down on CYBG. And so and we're seeing some of the usual suspects here. Saga 4.5% lower. Funding Circle also falling lower. A lot of these stocks already on the floor. Looking at Europe now, we look at, we can see here we've only got 5 stocks up, reflecting really the bearishness that we're seeing in Europe this morning. Air Liquide, they're looking really strong, making new highs, and the chart looking amazing with good upside targets there. And then on the downside, we've got Bayer, they're down nearly 4% this morning. That chart looking pretty scary. Fresenius down also by 3%, and SocGen down 2.5%. Banks generally lower. Here we see SocGen, BNP Paribas, Banco Santander, ING. The bank's been hit quite badly this morning. That's it for today. Until tomorrow, happy charting. See you then.